Hey guys, welcome back. So now we're jumping back into King in Black, but this time with King in Black Captain America, issue 1 by Danny Lore. And in this case, much like the other King in Black one-shots, you have a contained story which takes place within the main event that gives us a more zoomed in look at any particular character. And in this case, it mainly focuses on Steve, and it's very zoomed in, and you'll see what I mean in just a minute. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to get your spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squad up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so jumping in, just to give a perspective on the time frame of when this is happening. This issue fits in between the time space of when Dylan had freed Captain America with what we'd seen in King in Black and also in Venom issue 33, and this story fits in after this point but still before the big twist we'd seen in King in Black issue 4. And when we jump in, we immediately go over to Falcon and the Winter Soldier, who for the most part this story follows, as far as the narrative running alongside their mission, which they were given by the Avengers, which at this time was just to draw as many symbiotes away from Eddie Brock, but also minimize civilian casualties in the process. And the latter I feel like is always part of the mission, but even still sometimes it needs to be said. But even with Falcon and the Winter Soldier being in this story, and for obvious reasons, clearly, but even with this being the case, Danny Lore handles it well. Because on one hand, you could look at it like, oh, they're just trying to get me to watch the show. And I'm sure there's plenty of truth to that, but also this is one of those things to where I kind of want to either remind or make aware for anyone who's new, and just put out there that it's a common practice to see certain characters more frequently when they're set to appear in games or in films. Then you will also see them appear in the comics a little more than usual. And if you're new to it, with time you'll get used to it. It's okay. But then it's here where Bucky and Sam are getting bombarded, because much like everyone else, as soon as they destroy one of these symbiote dragons, with them chasing these guys down and getting a little too close, the symbiotes just reform, and then they have the issue of almost getting caught, which of course is not what you want when you're just trying to lead them away. But when this happens, Cap's shield just flies in, making space and helping these guys out. But also with seeing this, it's clear as day, this is the intro to Steve Rogers' Captain America. But also what I like is that when this happens, you hear the thoughts of Steve, and he's thinking to himself, he's very conscious of this entrance, because he knows what he means to the other heroes, and he knows that who he is and what he stands for, that it inspires them. And it's because of that, when he steps in, he's aware that he has to make this certain type of entrance, because he knows that it gives them their second wind, and it gets the people going. But in a way, it's almost like Captain America admits that he recognizes the responsibility and the value in that, and he fully embraces it, because at the end of the day, it just pulls the best out of other people. And whether you're fighting to win a war or fighting aliens to stop an invasion, the best out of others is what you need, because you don't want to jump in just well, hey guys, I don't know, we might make it through this, because that energy can then translate over, and it can make the difference between winning or losing. But in this case, when we see Cap arrive here and kind of go through these thoughts, at this point in time, he had just been freed by Dylan. And after being freed, he went to check on Sam and Bucky. And when he gets there, Sam is initially asking Cap, is he okay? Because he knows just minutes ago, Steve had his mind taken over by Knull, the god of the symbiotes, Lord of the Abyss. And he's asking Cap, are you okay? Do you need a minute? And even during this time, with Steve coming over to help them out, he's still dealing with the echoes of the voice of Knull, which are calling him a liar for making this inspirational entrance, or even telling Steve that the task that Bucky and Sam have, that it's more of a coward's task, and saying that they're running away from the real fight, and more or less saying that Cap is doing the same by going to help them. And it really shows us just the idea of Steve's mind trying to get free of the darkness that's still lingering and trying to pull him back to the hive. And with the way that we see this shown with Steve, there's times where he's talking to Bucky and he'll just zone out, or even when Sam tosses him back the shield and Steve will catch it, but even with doing so, he'll slip into a strong hallucination to where he'll see himself bonded again with Knull, losing control and attacking Bucky. But in reality for Steve, this isn't really happening. But rather in this moment, Knull is telling Steve that with coming out here, he's handed himself over to be the perfect weapon used by Knull. And not even in the grand sense of this all being about Steve Rogers, but more so to the point of him being made to be a weapon. And during the time that Knull had taken over Steve not long ago, that wasn't the first time that someone had used Steve as a tool or weapon to further their own agenda. And through this echo, Knull is just implying that perhaps Steve should just leave altogether, because him being there serves the threat of him being taken in again, to where he would then cause cause harm to the people he cares about. But with Bucky snapping at Steve and telling him to get his head in the game, this pretty much pulls Steve out of it for this moment, because Bucky also tells him like, hey, like if you're not completely here, let me know now and I'll take the lead. And it's interesting how like for Steve, like either way that he answers this question, it could be considered a lie. Because on one hand, he could say, no, I need some time to gather myself, like give me a second and I'm good. But then on the other hand, with him knowing that he's good enough to still fight and still contribute to some measure, that then challenges him with the idea of taking the lesser evil and telling the lie, if you will, by moving forward and continuing to help by more or less saying, I'm good, I got this. But even in this moment for Steve, like there's no time to explain all of that, because they hear a scream and Sam tells him he's found more civilians and Sam's about to go get them, but then Steve tells him like, no, stay with Buck, and Steve says that he'll handle it. But when Steve goes out there, once again, it's another illusion. Because in this case, the Echo has him playing out the scenario to where he doesn't trust Bucky or Sam, and like in the case of Sam, not trusting him to save these civilians, and in the case of Bucky, not telling him he's not okay. But in the case of Steve, with Knull playing this scenario through his mind, it comes to the conclusion of Captain America doing all of this work and doing the air quotes Captain America thing to do, but in this illusion or this scenario, it would only come down to him losing and getting himself and the civilians taken. But then in the case of how this actually goes down, Steve instead tells Bucky to save the civilians, and instead of Bucky, Steve stays with Sam. In this way, Steve will just help Sam set up the flame shooter contraption that he's gonna use to just fly around and light a bunch of these symbiotes on fire. And even when this happens, like Bucky, he agrees to do it because he trusts Steve, but even with Bucky agreeing and just taking the order, he still knew that something just wasn't right. Because for one, Steve really didn't know how to work this flame shooting device. And even though Sam walked Steve through the steps of how to mount it on and set it up, Sam still knew with having to take the extra time to break it down and explain it to Steve, this then let Sam know that something just wasn't right, because Steve wouldn't change the plans to something that was more inefficient and waste time in a high risk scenario, even if it was just a few seconds. And when Sam notices it, he does tell Steve like, okay, I know something is weird here and we really don't have the time to talk about it now, but we're gonna address this later. But with Steve struggling with the idea of whether he should or shouldn't tell Sam and Bucky, Knull then steps in kind of like, you know what, I'm gonna tell them for you. And when this happens, Steve sees Sam hit by the dragon, but when Steve intervenes to help Sam, he also sees himself throw the shield directly at Sam's head. But not long after seeing this, Steve realizes once again that it's another trick. But at this time, Sam is still up in the air and he does need help. And when Steve sees this, he just responds. And in this case, going more so by muscle memory, and with doing so, he just grabs some sound grenades and he goes in to help Sam, and he does it just as quickly as possible without leaving any time for thought in between each action. And when he does this, he's able to hang in there long enough to help Sam. But this time when the echo of Knull's voice comes back, he loses his grip, and the dragon, which was already coming down, it then aims for Bucky and the other civilians. But even when this happens, none of the civilians are killed. Bucky survived, Sam's okay, but in the case of Steve, who took a pretty hard hit, for him, it's here where the Knull echo leans in, and it shows him from here like where this moment forward could shift if he would just return to the hive. And at this point when this happens, it's like we see the thoughts of Steve shift into the thoughts of this echo, and it shows him how things could be moving forward if he were to be that symbol or beacon, but fully lean in and commit these services to Knull. And with the way that it's presented to Steve, it's very much like in a heroic fashion, but instead of Steve inspiring others, his inspiration would be an infection instead. But when this happens, like once again, these are just glimpses of what could be. And with the whole theme of this echo showing these visions to Steve, it's really just a ploy to play on his doubts and either draw him back to Knull or just take him out of the fight completely. But even with that being the case, I will say that I would have liked to see the nullified Falcon, like actually see some more of that. And I mean, like here we do get a glimpse of the silhouette of what Sam and Bucky would have looked like had they been actually nullified. But even with seeing like this glimpse, like I do believe that Sam Wilson, like the nullified Falcon, like I believe that would have came out pretty sick, and maybe even almost as sick as what we seen with Daredevil. And I mean almost, because Daredevil, he's still the best looking one. But even with seeing this vision, we come back to reality, and it's here where Sam helps Steve out of the rubble. But even with doing so, Steve tells him that he's not okay and that he can't do this. which once again was one of the intentions of the Knull Echo, which really just wanted to either re-recruit Steve or just take him out of the fight. But even after Steve had told Sam that he couldn't do this, both Sam and Bucky pick up the shield and they bring it back to Steve, and they tell him like, look, we know that you're not yourself, and with you saying that you can't, like, is that something you want to say, or is that something that Knull wants you to say? And when this happens, like, Bucky, he really connects with Steve and he tells him like, look, this voice inside of your head, like, I'm not gonna guarantee that it's gonna go away, because for Bucky, his never has, but instead he tells Steve like whatever it is that he truly believes, those thoughts will always be stronger. And in this case, it gives Steve enough to bring his mind back, which I gotta say, like, it only worked in this case because he wasn't actually in a symbiote. And like the whole idea of the Echo being in Steve's mind, it really didn't have any power but just fear and doubt. And all it could really do was just take those things and amplify them with different illusions in an attempt to sway Steve and have him go either one way or another. And in this case, with Bucky and Sam flipping the narrative and being that symbol or that beacon for Steve and steering him back in, it really just gave him a moment to realize like what he had been doing for them and others, to where for Steve in this case, he needed that beacon himself. And once he's back in, he's able to take like a single flame grenade and break a gas line and at least clear a way for him and the others to get out. And as a result, the civilians are safe-ish. The world's still ending, but at least now Steve, Sam, and Bucky, they're able to join the others and get back to the fight. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below so we can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. But I'll also say, like, this one was more of a story of the war of the mind, which is also why the nullified Cap looked different in this one. But in addition to that, like, the whole idea of the Knull echoes in the mind, like, aside from this issue, like, I'm not sure if anybody else has experienced that, like, aside from Steve. And I'm pretty sure he's gonna go back to the rest of the heroes, could be like, hey man, did y'all see all this weird stuff after y'all got freed? And everybody gonna be like, nah man, nah, you nope. And Steve's just gonna be like, oh, okay, yeah, me neither. Like, he gonna be the only one, man. But hey man, different strokes for different folks. But either way, let me know your guys' thoughts down in the comments below or over on Discord, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.